Welcome to The Curated Craftsman, a podcast where we'll learn about the hands, head, and heart behind creative entrepreneurs just like you. Kate Cook is the artistic drive behind Asphalt Canvas Custom Art and your host for this conversation about art, business, and belief.
Been finishing up a Oldsmobile painting here, and I still have a few when I do my paintings, usually there's like multiple coats of each color,
Yes.
And
oh wow, the gold. That is so cool.
Yeah, so I have to cut the colors in. That's how I correct them, as I'll, like, when they overlap, I have to go back in and cut them back in so they're correct. So this painting has two of each color layered, two layers of each color, and then I have to go back in and like clean it all up with the blacks. Like, I have to go back in and correct the outline.
Okay, I was wondering because everyone always asks me, like, do I do the black after or the black before? Because tattoo artists do the black before most of the time, and it's the complete opposite for me. So you're the same way. Like, you wait to cut.
Well,
do you
I'm
put
bold.
The black down first.
I do the black first, and then I touch it up at the end.
Okay.
So that's
awesome.
Yeah, that's kind of how I do it. I'll do the so for this, what I would start out with is, so I use alpha enamels for me, and this is going to cause some controversy, but I'm not an acrylic paint fan. To me, acrylic paint is for houses.
Yes.
It's just not, it doesn't have the soul that oil paint does. And I love enamel because it's a very hot rod paint. It's like very slippery, and it's slick, and I love how it flashes, like automotive paint that will lay flat. I just dig that kind of stuff, whereas acrylic is like, it has I guess it's like any material. You have to learn how to manipulate it to get it to do exactly what you want. But I just find that it is not sexy at all. But this kind of paint, to me, is very sexy. I just love this enamel paint.
Absolutely. And I found, like, people are very intrigued when they realize it's not like a traditional medium. Like, they realize, like, oh, I've never heard of painting with enamel before. And you're like, yes, I know. That's why you're going to remember me.
Right. But it's quite an old paint. They've been doing it for signs forever.
Yes.
It's
absolutely.
been in use for utilitarian purposes for such a long time, and really it's just pre-thinned oil paint. You know what I mean? It's not that much different than oil paint from a tube, but it's nice and liquidy and flows good right out of the can or the tube.
Definitely. And before Alpha, were you using One Shot primarily?
I was. I used One Shot for years and years and years, and I used to do my paintings on canvas too. So that's something that's changed, because this particular one's on plywood, and you can see how shiny that surface gets after you do multiple layers of the enamel. But I also paint on aluminum.
Yes.
And I think that just gives you the optimal kind of surface. I find that over the years, I just am always sort of trying to join the idea of, like, cars along with what the content of my art is. I love classic cars. I love that kind of Americana, and I love the sort of strength and adventure that those cars take you on. It's like, to me, they're the total highlight of like American culture. It's like a definition, the defining characteristic of American culture. Their can-do-itiveness, their independence, their visual statement. And that's not even the mechanical aspects of it. The mechanical aspect is something that's really interesting, that appeals to all of us also, I think. But I find that over the years, I'm always kind of trying to make the content with the materials match more and more. I was trained traditionally, like with when painting on canvas, oil paint. That was how I did all my college years, was doing really big canvases, stretched canvases. And, obviously the imagery was a little bit different back then in my college years than it is now. But I've always liked graphic kind of stuff, like bold outlines and shapes and that kind of thing. And, but I'm always feel like I'm trying to make the images and the materials like more in harmony with each other, and you think about building cars, it's like, what's that look like? What's that kind of paint look like? How does it interact? But at the same time, I love brushes. It's, for me, I'm just not an airbrush guy. Like, I have to have the texture in there. I think the texture really adds something to the soul of the painting. It's the flesh of the painting, if you will.
Today we're getting to know the hands, head, and heart behind Max Grundy Design, a professional artist and car builder with a unique vision of graphic, bold, and apocalyptic imagery. Based currently in Kansas after a big move from Southern California, Max has been specializing in original artwork, commercial illustration, and car building with logo design for the past 25 years. His impressive list of past clients includes SEMA, Disney, and Napa Auto Parts. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so the formalities. So, but yes, I love that. And when I was looking at your website, I saw this little quote you had on there. It said, the cars are the characters communicating a striking narrative in an alternative post-apocalyptic future where, quote, fear is the new beauty. Do you still think you make artwork like that?
I do.
Yeah, I do too.
I think, there's a little bit of these stories that are a little bit of a tangent from our timeline, I guess. Like, if we had the timeline moving along, like, what happened if we broke off in the 50s and continued, along.
Ooh, I love that thought. Yeah.
That's kind of a neat thought. And what could happen in that time? Are we talking about time travel in this alternative future where maybe that discovery was made? That's something people used to be very interested in, and we don't think about it so much now, but it was, something people thought maybe they could conquer. What could we do with that? What does hot rods look like with time travel? What does hot rods look like with possibly a nuclear event that may have happened? What do the survivors of that look like? And I think that the art represents those sort of heroes of that alternative reality. Sometimes it is just reality. I think, some of my stuff has natural disasters and things like that, but it always sort of represents, I think, a heroic existence. One of the things that makes old cars and art with old cars so exciting is that it makes the mundane sacred. And, when you have an old car, you go to the post office and it's exciting. Yes. If you drive an old car, you take your wife to lunch and it's like, it's a nice date.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And we talk about that stuff a lot. And it's, when you're riding around an old car, it's like you're making an artistic statement. You're really doing something that's funner, more interesting, more intellectual than just getting into some sterile EV car.
Yes.
And running your errands, it's
totally
exciting,
Yes, and you're kind of
soul.
forced to be mindful when you're driving an old car because you don't have the luxuries that you would a normal car like an EV or a current modern day car. You can't really be mindless. You kind of have to know, especially if it's not an automatic, like you got to know when to shift. And like, for instance, my car doesn't have air conditioning and we're in Texas, so you're constantly like thinking about that. But there's like 1,000 things that you're thinking about, but you're so right when you say the mundane. That's such a beautiful statement. It makes the mundane sacred. I think that is such a true statement with old cars. I love it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think it forces you to be present in the moment.
Absolutely.
If you're an old car, you are present for every moment. And sometimes those moments are painful.
Yes.
And I think that old cars drive out the casual observer. So for me, if somebody has an old car, especially if they're an artist and has an old car, they are definitely not dilettantes.
Yes.
They are definitely all in because, you can't be a casual old car owner. There's always, you can't be like, oh, I have this old car and we go do this. No, it's like, you got to be in love with that car.
It's life. Yes.
You gotta be in love with that car because it's a constant pain in the ass all the time.
Yes.
And so I think when I see somebody or I know somebody who has an old car or oftentimes multiple old cars, that just is a level of their passion to me. They are that into it, because I see a lot of people. I've done a lot of shows over the years, and I see a lot of people, they roll up in their Hyundai, and they're fully rockabillyed out, but they're driving up in a Hyundai, and it's like, like,
yes,
it doesn't seem right to me, but
yes,
we all have to, have curveballs in life we have to deal with. So no judgment on them, but it is
yeah, no, I
interesting
get that.
to me.
It's like you almost know a little bit about them when they show up in the old car. Like you kind of have kindred spirit type of a thing almost.
Yeah, I guess that's what I mean by it. It's like, they're a serious hunter.
Yeah, yeah, I love
they're a
that.
serious hunter. They're not just out there wearing the costume.
Yes.
Yeah,
So
they're not just in the costume.
did you start art first or did you start car building first?
Definitely art first.
Okay.
I can remember making art from a very early age. The story I always tell is I can remember as far back as in preschool.
Okay.
Being in preschool, my mom would drop me off at the local high school to go take preschool classes from a high school kids. That was how they did it where I grew up.
Oh, that's
so you
too
would take
cool.
preschool, that they would high school kids would teach the preschool.
Okay, that's kind of cool.
It was.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed normal to me. So I would get left there for, it was probably, a couple hours. And, my teacher seemed very old at the time, but she was just a kid. She maybe was 18, but I remember my teacher at the time. And I remember we were getting fed sloppy joes and we had all the vegetables and we had the bun and the meat. I remember Cheetos, like vividly, like puffed Cheetos. I can remember that. Like, we were making our own plates and making our own food, and that was part of the day's activities. And I took the ingredients, and I remember making a face out of the food. And I was just sort of playing with my food.
Right.
But the teacher came over to where I was seated, sitting, and said, "Oh, that's so neat. You have the olives for the eyes, you have the Cheeto for the mouth on this sloppy Joe sandwich." And that was, I think, my earliest moment and the first moment that I can remember making something artistic that people enjoyed.
Wow.
And so I think for me, that's always a core memory, is the audience is a big part of it. And I love what Rick Rubin says about, you have to make art for yourself. You can't make it for your audience. And the natural consequence of that is that the art is really good if you make it for yourself, and your audience will love it. But you can't start out to make it for the audience, because it just will not be as good. Yes. But I do think that the audience is really important, because you are inspiring them. I hate the word entertaining, but I think you're inspiring them. You're making them.
Well, do you think that the audience finds you then, or how? In like a working artist scenario, do you have to find the audience? Like what comes first, kind of a thing?
Good question. I don't know.
I've currently been wondering that.
I don't know what I would say that so you're asking, do you think your audience finds you, or do you
Correct.
think you find your audience?
Correct.
I would have to say it's both, because I think for me, I really found my audience so old cars have always been part of my life for as far back as I can remember, even before I drew them. And I drew them as easily as early as my son, 7. I mean, he's 11 now, but I can remember drawing cars 7, 8, 9 years old.
Wow.
So I remember doing that very vividly, as far as finding the audience. But I think, for me, I feel like I really found my audience when I started mixing together things that I just really enjoyed. Like I started putting together cars, UFOs, robots, apocalyptic stuff, natural disasters, just sort of themes that I was interested in, and seemed to showcase the heroism of the old car. I love that. Yeah. An old car is a little bit of like a chariot. You're sort of a warrior with an old car versus, it's just transportation. It's like an old car has nothing to do with that, really. Like the transportation is just the sort of accidentally what's happening.
Yes. Yes.
There always seems to be a sort of a heroic feeling, I think, with the old car. But when I started my whole thing was, even though I've always loved to draw cars, I didn't want to just draw a car sitting there.
Yeah.
I didn't want to have just a car, here's this car, look at this car, it's amazing.
Yes.
That was missing something to me. That was very like making the car into an idol.
Like a stale thing, kind of. There was no creativity.
Like a stale thing just sitting there.
Yes,
versus
I totally resonate with that.
There's a difference between an idol and an icon, and I think that there's something very negative about it being an idol. It's almost like you're lusting after it. Whereas an icon, it's like you've involved the viewer in it somehow, and they are now present in your design, which to me, I think is the best design. If you can pull your viewer into it, then I think you really have succeeded in your work. If the viewer gets to put their own story into it.
Yes.
And I find that people do that for sure.
Yes.
I always feel like the more I interact with people and people at shows, and these days I don't so much anymore, but I used to a lot.
Yeah.
I always find that, if somebody is a Democrat, they pull those themes out in your artwork. Well, this is what's happening in society and this and this,
yes.
But if they're very conservative Republican, they would pull out stuff along there. So
yes,
I have found that people tend to if it's good art, I think they place themselves into it.
That's interesting. I can totally see that, because you have the natural disaster aspect versus the fuel guzzling American automobile.
Yeah.
I love that. It's a cool correlation, and that really I can see that within your art. That's really cool.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting to sort of figure it out, but I always felt like I found my audience when I put together the things that I liked the most.
Oh, I love that. That's a very simplistic way to put it.
It wasn't, and not that I don't have some artwork where it's just a car sitting there, because I do.
Right.
I do have
yes,
that kind of stuff, but usually it's there's a story to be told, and I think my success has always been in those times where I'm telling a story.
Yes.
And inviting the viewer to be part of that story.
That's really, so with that said, how did you, this I guess is probably the same answer, but how did you find your style? Because you have a very recognizable style that's so different than anyone. It's yours alone, but it's so different and beautiful. Is that something that you practiced for, or kind of honed in on certain things with other paintings?
I think I was really heavily influenced from, growing up in the 1980s. I think I was definitely influenced by skateboard art.
Okay.
I think I liked skateboard art more than I liked actually skateboarding, but the whole culture that went around with that was really cool. The music, the clothing, the art, all of the magazines, all of that stuff went together. It was a culture, and I liked that. So I was definitely influenced by skateboard culture and snowboard culture. But I was always influenced by vintage design, vintage artwork, which is oftentimes where skateboard art came from, I
didn't know that.
Well, I guess that depends on who you ask, but to me, skateboarding art is very graphic, very bold, and that comes from vintage design.
That's true.
Simplicity is a ways that people would reproduce art and use it for utilitarian purposes. Bold and simple was a clear way to communicate and a clear way to make it. It wasn't so complicated. So growing up in the 80s, I always liked bold graphic things, but I always liked stuff from the 50s, B-movie posters. Always loved movie posters. That was always something that appealed to me.
Oh, same.
And very bold and graphic in the 1980s too, so
your style just kind of morphed into what it is now. It wasn't something that you made choices about, or
but I think it's interesting. It's when you have an artist style, which I think is a good idea to have your own style, because it's you can't really mix Chinese and German together and have it sound right.
Right.
And I think that if you have a cohesive style, it gives it more um, what's the word I'm looking for? Credibility. I think it has
Okay,
more
yeah.
Yeah, I think you have more credibility when you have a cohesive style.
I agree.
It just makes it, some people say it and say, oh, that's so-and-so's work. And it gives it more credibility,
Yeah.
like it's a real thing. Whereas if their styles are too different, if you're doing, multiple different things,
Hmm.
I think it lends less credibility to you. And I think
Yes.
that we as artists can struggle with that. Cause I mean, I don't know about
Yeah.
you, but I'm like totally like shiny thing. I'm over here, shiny thing over here, like we just finished restoring a couch.
Oh, I can't wait to see it. I can't wait to see it. I've been following your Instagram stories.
Yeah, we just finished this couch and it's awesome, but what am I doing restoring a couch? It's like, well, we needed a couch. Can you really justify taking the time out of your day away from artwork to make a couch? But to me, they're all related. If
Yes,
I'm
they are.
working on a cart, or I'm restoring a piece of mid-century modern furniture, or I'm doing a drawing, or I'm doing a sticker design, or I'm doing a painting,
Yes.
I don't know. To me, it's all in the same basket, for
Yes.
me.
Yes.
And some people, I don't know, maybe they're more regimented, which I think in a lot of ways I am kind of regimented as far as what, we work on and what our workload during the day looks like. But there is a lot of flexibility. I'm more concerned about being productive
Mm.
than I am about being focused.
Oh, that's an interesting insight. I've never looked at those as two separate things.
Yeah, I think they can be, I
Yeah.
think, but I don't know. I think a great artist should be a little bit ADD. I think,
Yes.
I've
Curious at
noticed the
least.
difference. Yeah, I think I've noticed with craftsmen sometimes that they can really get super uptight about something, making something perfect. And
Yeah.
to me, that's a reflection of a weakness in design.
Mm.
I think if you're too focused on craft and you're too focused on the perfection of the thing, I think that you're overcompensating for a design that's weak.
So how would you define craftsman then? How would you define a craftsman? Like, are there traits that you looked for, or would you consider yourself a
Well,
craftsman?
I think a craftsman would make an object that has perfect paint on it, because
Okay.
they have taken the time to master their craft and know exactly how that paint is.
Okay.
But I look at it and I think this looks uptight to me.
Wow.
I
Okay.
I wish it would have a little bit of flaw to it. Like
Yeah.
I don't see blood. I don't see the blood and meat in that if it's
Yeah.
too perfect. And I
Yeah.
know people like that, not necessarily artists, but I think I know people like that where it's like, man, this is just like too perfect, this
Yeah.
thing that they, and
Yeah.
and and I think that sometimes people can obsess with that because they don't
Mm.
really know how to make a design interesting.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
I guess in some ways I'm guilty of it too. Like if
Mhm.
I'm restoring a project and it's like driving me crazy that the paint is doing something funky, or
Mhm.
there's a crack where I don't want it to be, it drives me crazy if you start to invest your time in something and it drives you crazy if you can't get it perfect. Um,
Yes.
but I also know that I'm doing it. And I think
Yes.
maybe that's the difference between an artist and a craftsman. As a craftsman doesn't really see that there is a problem with focusing too much on technical issues. Whereas an artist would be like, whoa, I'm getting too obsessed with this technical aspect.
Huh.
I need to back off and like, is this a good composition?
So
Like,
that's crazy to think because if you were building cars, I would imagine that's a very technically forward
yeah,
thinking thing. Like you can't be like, oh, well, I'm
definitely
just gonna
can
smudge it
be.
here.
I think it definitely can be when you're building cars, obviously, because cars can be very technical. But for me, I feel sorry for someone who's too obsessed with their paint.
Yeah,
And that doesn't mean I don't love and respect the time and effort that they put into it.
of
But
course.
if I see a guy that's got this perfect, flawless paint job and they're really worried about people touching it, they're really worried about driving it,
Right.
I feel a little bit sorry for them because I think they're missing the artistic aspect of it.
Right.
I think, is that car got a cool stance? Has got a cool design? Is the top chop cool? What are the body modifications? Like, what are these things done to it? Whereas
Mhm.
some people will just sit there and sand a damn hood till
Yeah.
the end of time
Yeah.
to make it have this perfect flash of paint. And I really just don't give a crap about that. I mean, don't get me wrong. I love a nice paint job and I'm happy when I can get one on my car. And I It's not me. That's usually Mike Howell, my friend who's a real painter.
Yes.
My paintings, my paint jobs, maybe my paintings too. My paint jobs are very imperfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I don't mind it, and I don't mind it with my paintings too. If I get, sometimes there's some dust in the paint,
Same.
maybe worse, maybe a pice of lint.
Yeah,
It
little
doesn't
dog
bother
hair.
me that. I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully I can pick out the dog hair if it happens, but I don't mind the imperfections, and I don't know, that's more interesting to me, but I don't know. I just feel a little bit sorry for people who obsess too much about the technical aspect of things, because I think they're not asking themselves the bigger questions like, is this a good design? Is this inspiring for people? Does this motivate people? Does this teach people something? What are the intellectual aspects of that thing that you're making? Not just the paint's perfect, the body works perfect.
Right.
So
right.
I think the separation between artists and craftsmen has something to do with that.
Wow. I'll be honest, I never even thought of the difference between the two. So I really appreciate the insight, because I think that's a very good definition for the both of them. I think the world needs both of them. And if you find somebody that has a little bit of both in them, a little bit of artist, a little bit of craftsman, I think that's a really cool mix of a person.
That, and also proof that we should work together.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
We all the boats in the harbor rise together.
Yes.
We definitely we're creatures, I think, to me, on a spiritual level, designed to collaborate.
Yes.
And I think that's why we get married, and I think that's why we have kids, is because we are inclined to collaborate and have kids too.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you believe that your faith has helped you in your art then, in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. But maybe my art has helped my faith too.
I totally resonate with that saying.
I think for me, we always grow up thinking there's something sort of spiritual or transcendent about artists, musicians. It's a little bit of a cliche.
Yeah.
Like what's something someone would say, oh, they're a genius, or something like that. You hear people say that kind of thing, and there's some truth behind all of that, because I think when you make art, you are playing with a couple ideas that are inherent to spirituality.
Yes.
And I think that is faith and prophecy. I think that when you're a maker, whether you're an artist, whether you're a musician, whether you're an actor, whatever you are, when you make stuff, and even craftsmen, when you make something, it's like you're an alchemist, man. You're putting something together from nothing.
Yes.
You're just taking the pieces, you're just taking the raw material, and you have this faith that it's going to work out. Yes. And you're playing, building, and you don't care. You're free to make, and that's faith, and that's a faith, that's exercising faith, because you don't know where the path is going to lead to.
Yeah. What the end product's going to be.
You might have a few ideas, but it's like, you don't know what the end product is going to actually be. Yeah. And that leads to the next part of prophecy, is like you're using a part of your mind, of your spirit, this predictive part of your mind and spirit that is looking into the future and imagining, visualizing, hoping for this fantastic final product. And that's prophecy. Faith and prophecy. And so I think artists, even atheistic artists, or people that have no beliefs at all, not necessarily anti, but don't really think of any of it, I think they tend to be spiritual beings, because they're constantly exercising their power of faith and their power of prophecy. And I think it's like lifting weights. The more you repetition and you do that same thing over and over again, the muscle has no choice but to build and to grow. And I think that's how faith and prophecy works. The more you use it, the more it grows. For me, I'll just sit in bed, and I'm very happy with my thoughts. Yeah. I'm very content. I'm very content with my thoughts, because my thoughts entertain the shit out of me. You know, it's like I'll sit there and I'll think, you know, my brain's on this roller coaster and it's going up the hill to this roller coaster. And once it goes over that hill, I'm sorry, it's going to go until it's done. There's no stopping, you know? So I'll work through a problem as I'm falling asleep, and it'll just go and go and go and go. And I'll just keep working through it. It's like when a record skips, you know, it's like that. And my mind is constantly trying to work on how do I get rid of that skip, whatever the skip is. It could be a top chop on a car that's wrong. It could be the design of something that's wrong, you know, like an overcomplicated design. And I need to release myself to make it more simple so I can.
That's so funny you say that as far as thoughts go, because I think that plays a lot with the prophecy thing. And I was thinking the other day, I've always had not an issue, but I've always questioned a little bit like prayers, like how do those work? Because I do believe there is some sort of fate playing into our existence. And so the other day I saw something and it made me start thinking while I was driving, and I thought, man, I think God wants us to pray, because if we're praying for something, we're hoping for something. And if we're hoping for something, then we're pretty naturally going to be in a positive mindset if we're thinking about what we're hoping for.
Well, we're going to follow what is going to put that in line too.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's like, and like it goes with the prophecy thing.
Let's call it prayer. Let's call it a dream. I mean, how different are these things?
Right.
Those words are not that different.
Yes.
But if you're constantly putting your mind's eye to that thing, your actions follow your mind's eye.
Yeah, and like Morgan said, it's like when you go to high five somebody, if you're looking at their elbow, your hands will meet. It's like if you throw a baseball, you're gonna pretty much throw it wherever you're looking. You're not gonna throw it and then it goes somewhere else if you're looking at
well, that's what they say in skateboarding and snowboarding, is that your body follows your head.
Okay, well, I wish I would have known that when I was snowboarding, because I was terrible at it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, likewise.
I think it's a tall person thing.
Totally. Yeah, it might be a tall person thing.
That's what I'm blaming. I'm blaming that.
Yeah, so maybe your thoughts and your beliefs and your spirituality are the head to your being, and the rest of it follows with that. And maybe that's the whole point of spirituality and art, is that it creates a sort of beacon in which everything trails after, you know?
Yeah, and that's why, like with this membership I'm starting, I'm calling it the hand, head, and heart, because I think, you know, you can have the hand and the head, you can have the business sense and the art, but if you don't have some sort of like spiritual belief in something greater than yourself, or like somewhere to go, you know, like I don't think you can get the full package. Like you're missing out on that one important ingredient, whether it be God or whoever else you believe in or whatever else you believe in. There's that spiritual aspect that if you don't have it, I don't know. I don't know if that makes it harder or not, but that's what I want to learn, is if that matters, you know, from other people.
Well, yeah, and I think it's an intellectual part too. I mean, you got to constantly be thinking about things, you know. It drives me crazy. These people have their mind made up so early.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you ain't dead, it's too early to have your mind made up. You know,
I totally agree.
You can't have your mind made up about things, because then you overlook stuff. It's like saying, I know exactly how every composition of art and painting I'm going to do is going to end up. I am at my 10. It's like saying that you know exactly how everything is going to turn out all the time, and it's not. You know, it's different. You know, you have to be open for that. You know, because it's going to be different. It's going to surprise you, and you know, I've found that oftentimes letting the art dictate where you go is much, much better than what your plan may have been. And you serendipity, you can call that chance, you can call that an accident, you can call that luck. I don't give a crap what somebody calls it, but I think you have to be open to letting the art take you someplace.
Yes, I totally agree.
Don't be afraid up. You know, it's like there's no shame in chopping a car twice. You know, because the first time didn't work out. You know, and art's the same way. You know, and I think that's where I'm grateful for my ADD. Is it's like, you know, I know if I'm like gonna go work on a couch for a few hours, I'll come back to that painting and I'll know exactly what it needs. Yeah. You know, whatever it is I'm working on, the t-shirt design, whatever it is, I'll be able to see it clearly, you know. And I think, you know, maybe as artists, we're just wired that way a little bit.
I think we are.
because you get so, you get so caught up in looking at the surface of this thing for so long, you can't see the forest for the trees, and you can't. So I don't know. I'm a big advocate for ADD in art.
Yeah, well, so with that said, I was gonna ask when you were talking about the couch and things like that, how often do you paint in your business? How often are you creating artwork?
Oh, well, every day I
Yeah.
always wish that I would do more, because just money alone, it's an incredible revenue stream, and we have great supporters. So it's like, really, the amount of money we make is up to us.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
you want to make more money, you can just work more, and you're blessed that you're able to sell that artwork. So there's that, but then there's always all these other things going on where it's like,
Right.
well, also I like to make cars, and I like to work on furniture and stuff, this other stuff that I like. Do I want to just have somebody else do that? Do I want to have somebody else build my car? The answer is no. For me, that doesn't work out.
I think it's healthy that
Problem
artists
run
have hobbies.
into, yeah, probably run into is just trying to direct your hours to where you're actually moving forward on things. So I have a schedule that I like to follow, and I like to paint a certain amount of time during the day. I like to work on my house a little bit every day. I like to work on my cars every day a little bit. And I have to set aside some time for like social media stuff. So I make sure that I'm doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. So there's, and adult stuff like,
Yeah. Well, and then you have
make
your family too.
yeah, exactly. There's the time that you have to set aside to make sure that you label all your receipts correctly. It's like, am I doing paperwork? Am I going through
Yes.
the mail that's slowly making a huge pile on my desk,
Yes.
I have to simultaneously be a regimented free spirit. It's, for
That's
me,
a,
I'm constantly trying to pursue a more regimented life, but it's difficult to get as much done as you want to. But for me, the goal is always, at the end of the day, be extremely satisfied with your day. And
yeah.
for me to be extremely satisfied with my day, I have to do all the things. I have
Me
to do
too.
all the things.
Yes.
I have to have like touched all these things, and I feel really satisfied.
Yes.
But on the same coin, it's like sometimes I can work for hours and hours and hours on something, and it's just not scratching that itch. Like,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
just not getting to where I want it to be. And then I'll have some days where I'll come after that, and I'll spend a very brief amount of time on something, and I will feel like what happened was a revelation. The little thing, it's like, I just realized
Yeah.
it's a really cool thing that maybe I want to put dinosaurs in my artwork. Dinosaurs. Why haven't I thought of dinosaurs before? So you heard it here first. There'll be dinosaurs coming
I was
up.
about to say that is such a good addition. How do you, since you are a working artist, your income comes from your artwork, so to speak. How do you create art if you are having, or do you create art if you're having a family situation, or you're like having a bad day, or
Oh
you
man,
know,
that's
you
all the time. Well, everybody has bad days, and I feel like I have way more bad days than I should, as far as if something happens with family and it's like tempers are flaring. That's never a place
right,
that I want to be in. I
right,
don't like, but I think for me, it always comes back to like passion. You have to have that thing that is like, that just thrills you. It's like, if you don't have that thing, you got to find it.
yeah,
Like, what is that thing that just makes your heart light on fire when you think about it? For me, it's like 100 things.
yeah,
Like, there's 100 things in my life that I just really love with a passion that I would probably die for.
mhm.
And I'm not saying that in a bragging way. I just
No,
think
no,
that for me, what always helps me move along is having a love for a lot of things.
right,
And then you never get burned out. You never get tired of a certain thing. You never run out of ideas,
yeah,
because all those things that you love are all like a tree. They're all connecting and touching branches with each other all the time.
right,
And
right,
so for me, it always comes back to passion. And I guess that's why I like and do so many things with my work, is it makes me never get bored. It makes me
yeah,
never get burnt out. And I'm always in a way to like force these things together. Like,
mm,
how can we work furniture in with painting
mm,
cars? How can furniture be with cars?
Well, that makes me think, you say furniture and cars. You just did the RV, and that's a very good example of that.
The Car-V was a little bit of a revelation for me. Sorry, I'm still plugging things in here.
Oh, you're fine. Everyone can see your beautiful workspace there with the awesome chandelier.
Yeah, you like look at I'm dropping the phone. There's my chandelier.
Oh, I love it. I love it.
But for me, the Car-V, it really got me interested in the idea of like an art car.
Mm.
But I thought, I had this talk with my wife, and I was saying, the Car-V was really well received at SEMA. I think people like it because it's just a little bit odd.
Yes.
But it's a little bit traditional. It's a little bit fun. It's one of those things where it's like you can see yourself camping in that thing.
Yes. And have you guys taken it out camping?
No, we haven't. We went right into winter pretty much.
Yeah.
By the time you get back from SEMA, it's, November 15th or whatever, or November 10th.
Right.
And you're coming up on Thanksgiving and you're thinking about Christmas. For us, Christmas starts when SEMA is over.
Yes.
Like when SEMA is done, it's like we go right into the Christmas, like Candace puts the Christmas tree when I'm away at SEMA. That goes.
Oh, that's cool. I love that.
So yeah, that's our start point for the holidays. I talked to her, about that, and I said, because we had like a national park style sign that was up next to the Car-V.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
We'd made it from scratch, and it was just those few, and we had a model of the Car-V that was on display in the Car-V, and it's like you don't have to do everything perfect.
Yes.
Like you don't have to have a set of 10 things that you're planning to do and then fill all those 10 things like a checkoff list. Not that I have a problem with that, because it's good to have goals for sure, but you got to be open to letting things move and change a little bit organically.
Yes.
And so I think for me, it's always just a little bit like letting things change as I'm working and being okay with how that goes. And so with the Car-V, we had all these elements that sort of created a little vibe. We had the national park sign. We had another little hand painted sign that actually looked like crap. It was like a sign that somebody would paint on there saying "Gone Fishing," and they would hang it on their business. But we had it, and it said Max Grundy Art, and this is a story nobody knows about, but we actually cobbled this sign together out of pallets at SEMA. So like at SEMA, there would be piles of trash that people would make. So they would get their parts and whatnot shipped in there. And then they would take all these pallets and pieces of broken wood and they would just discard it to the side. And then before the show starts, they come and clean it all up. Okay. So we took a bunch of those elements, because you don't go to SEMA with lumber, you don't go to SEMA with that stuff. But I had this idea. I'm like, I want to put this kind of Gone Fishing sign up, but it talked about this is Max Grundy Art, but we hand painted it. It just looked really bad, but it fit perfectly because it looked like something you would see in the backwoods area, And we made it out of parts there. We had a drill and we had a jigsaw, and we actually surprisingly had quite a few tools with us there at SEMA that we just happened to have. It's amazing what you have with you when your car is also a house,
Yeah.
But so back to my wife, we're always talking about like, how can we make cars more like art cars, like we're open and willing to sort of venturing into those areas where a car build is as much about like a theme or a vibe as it is about the car, because I think if you just focus too much on the car, it's a little bit boring. It's a little bit arrogant. It's like, oh, look at this. I have this Ferrari. I have this Porsche, is that design? Is that art? Or is that ego? Is it just that you've told yourself that this is the brand, and I don't know. I think I intentionally seek out kind of the lower models of cars because the elitism of cars kind of drives me up the wall. With Chrysler, it's like the Chrysler 300 I don't really want a Chrysler 300. I couldn't customize it. True. I like a Newport. And it's like a Newport, I can chop the top. I can put air ride into it. I can redesign the upholstery in any way that I want, and it's total freedom.
Well, it reminds me, and you're going to laugh at this because I'm about to talk about PT Cruisers, which are like the crap car of all kind. But as a kid, we'd go to car shows all the time, and that's how I grew up in the car industry too. And I remember a car show my mom and I went to just at random with my little brother. It was like in the Applebee's parking lot, and it was it was a PT Cruiser club, but
No.
yes, like I'll never forget this. It was definitely a core memory because I think it inspired me to do what I'm doing today. But it was all these guys that owned PT Cruisers, and they tricked them out with like themes. And the one I remember the most was this PT Cruiser that was underwater themed. And when you
Love
lifted
it.
the hatch, there was a full-blown fish, like a fish tank with real fishes in it, and like a waterfall. And it like blew my mind that this was in a car. And so from then on, I was like, I'm going to own a PT Cruiser one day, which of course that's changed since then. But the fact of the themed car has always been something that's intrigued me. And that's why I like lowrider culture, because I feel like they always take the car and there's a lot of different artistic elements to it, like chrome engraving and custom paint and upholstery. And normally there's a theme involved and there's a story as to why it's themed that way. And so I appreciate that very much. And so I definitely resonate with what you're saying on that.
Yeah, that's funny. Core memories, it's like with the sloppy Joe sandwich for me. It's like,
yes.
It hadn't occurred to me that art was something that could please people. But when I saw that in my teacher, it definitely made me want to pursue it. And I felt like that set me on a path to always wanting to try to please people or make people happy or joyful by something I create. So I can't lie and say that an audience reaction doesn't mean something to me, because I think it does, and that doesn't mean I still won't do what I want and do what I believe in, because that will, but I love it when other people love it. And sometimes people love it more than you love it. And that is really saying something. If somebody loves something more than you do, and it drives them to tears, it's like, holy crap, that is an amazing thing,
Yeah, it's definitely, you're like a conduit kind of for that. Like you said, Rick Rubin, you're actually the one that turned me on to Rick Rubin, and I'm reading his book right now that he just released. And man, it's like mind blowing, some of the stuff that he's put in there, but I can hear a lot of what you say, being inspired by some of the things you've said. And
I always listen. I like the music he produced as a young man. I like the bands that he worked with and stuff when I was young, in my 20s growing up. I just liked that kind of music. So I always grew up knowing his name, but knowing nothing about him.
Yes.
And, ever since the day of, social media and everything has transparent, and it's like, now you see all these different interviews with him and you hear his philosophies. And I just, he's a huge inspiration for me, along with Jordan Peterson, these intellectuals that are also creative and they think things through. That is in line with me, my spirituality, my values, is to try to really think these things through and come up with some really satisfying conclusions. So
yes. Well, before I forget this, I want to know what your first chop was. Like, what car was that, and how did it go?
It was a Mercury.
Okay.
And we had to do it twice.
Oh gosh. Okay.
So I'm probably going to throw some people under the bus here, but so when I was 19 years old, okay, so quick little history about my family. We were a car family, grew up around cars. Just cars were part of our culture. I didn't know any better. That was just, how our life was. But our family was a big muscle car family.
Same.
So same.
Yep.
So we had like Camaros, Chevelles, Malibus, mostly GM stuff, but that was always around. Okay. And that was what we tinkered with. And that's what my brothers would fix up and make nice. And that would become their car. This is growing up in the 80s, mind you. So, they were doing this in the 80s. And I had to discover on my own that I was interested in 50s cars. But my dad would race a Corvette when he was a kid. But before that, when he was in his mid-20s, he actually had a chopped Mercury. And it was only chopped a couple inches. And but as I was growing and learning like what I enjoyed as far as cars and loving 50s culture and hot rods and customs, I would talk to my dad more and more about it. And, he would see, me with a magazine, and he'd say, oh, that's a sweet 49 Merc, or that's this. And he would know all the models and years, and we'd talk about it. And it was always a connection with me and my dad that my brothers and my dad never really had as much as I did, because I love the generation that my dad grew up in. He grew up in the 50s, hot rods and customs.
Yeah, you have some cool
he was in
pictures of
his
him.
he was in his prime, during
Yeah.
that time, and I just really love that. And I think my brothers weren't so much in the 50s like I was,
Hmm.
but just obsessed over it. And so I grew up with stories mainly of my dad's 49 Merc that he had that was chopped and had no door handles, and it had a button in the door that you would lean on the sheet metal and it would push the button and that would open the
Oh,
door.
that's cool. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how that worked, but that's how he always described it.
Yeah.
So I grew up with stories with that and him racing his 1965 Corvette. So that must have came in the 60s because my dad in the mid 50s had 50s cars.
Okay.
Like I guess it would have been like 58. He would have in 1958. He would have been about 25 in 1958. And
Hmm.
that's when he had his chopped Merc. It's
That's
thereabout.
ideal.
I'm not sure the exact,
That's ideal.
days.
I'm envious.
It's kind of ideal. Yeah, that's what
Yes.
I always think of. I think, man, my dad grew up in the heyday of the 50s. He was in the
Yeah.
prime of his life in that time. And I just love that about that. I wish I could have lived that time of
Same.
his life with him.
Yeah.
But so I grew up with stories with my dad's Corvette and my dad's Mercury, chopped Mercury, and it just made me want one even more.
Yeah.
So when I was quite young, I mean, by about the time I was 15, I was pretty fully submerged into hot rods and customs and got really into lowriders at a young age. I guess that comes along with the SoCal culture.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
For me, I was always reading like lowrider magazines and classic truck magazines. That was
Okay.
always my thing. I didn't get to Hot Rod magazine till later on. But for some reason, I went into lowriders and classic trucks and customs really early on and became obsessed with that. So I always knew I was going to get a Mercury. And when I was 19 years old, I had just barely, it was the summer after graduation from high school. I had finally found a Mercury, and I was living in Utah because that's where I grew up.
Okay.
And this Mercury was up in Idaho, and ended up going there. And it was like, I can still remember the guy's name, Roger Littleford. I think he's still alive today. And he actually followed my Mercury build, and he knows everything that's going on with me in my life. And and this is a true story. And the reason I know is because I have a guy that knows him personally that comes to the hot rod shows. And he would tell me, he says, he knew that Mercury was the Mercury you bought from him. And he followed the whole build. And he is really smart, knowledgeable guy, Roger Littleford. It's easy to remember the name because he sold me a Mercury, so Roger Littleford. But
yeah.
But anyway, so I knew I was going to get this Mercury, and I was going to chop it. So got the Mercury at 19. We totally stripped the car apart, replaced all the rotten stuff, and then it pretty much kind of sat while I finished college.
Okay.
And I was in college for quite a while. I did a bachelor's in illustration and a master's in painting and drawing.
Okay.
And so after all that time had went by, the car kind of sat. I mean, it's kind of a funny thing because now we do a car every year, but my first Mercury, it took a long time before we get it done. Something like 16 years before I was driving it. It's crazy, right?
Wow.
But I originally, when I was about 22 years old or something like that, like a few years after I had the Mercury, I took the car to Bo Huff to chop it because I didn't know anything about chopping cars. I just knew I liked them chopped.
Okay.
So I took it to Bo Huff, and I didn't really feel like the way he chopped it, it didn't look right to me. It didn't look like the Barris cars. And
did you pay him for that?
Oh yeah. I paid him a lot.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, Bo was great. I have a lot of fond memories of Bo, and I loved hanging out with him.
Of course,
we were pretty close friends for a lot of years because he was out of Utah too. But I disagree with how he would chop Mercuries,
Right.
So he chopped the car, and then it just didn't seem right to me. Something felt off about it, and I could not, for the longest time, figure out what it needed.
Okay.
And when he chopped it, he didn't move the quarter windows back, because the biggest mistake people make when they chop a car is they take a curve that's like this and they just go straight down.
Oh, and they flatten it.
Well, they need to flatten it, but they don't. what they'll
Oh, I
do is
see.
they'll
Okay.
take something like this and they'll keep a curve that's like this and they just go straight down.
Gotcha,
But when you
gotcha.
go down, you're supposed to flatten it out.
Widen it out.
You're,
Okay, yeah.
you're reshaping the car. You're not just going straight down, but a lot of guys don't realize when and where and how much to change the contour of something.
Of that curve. Okay. That's so
Exactly. And
interesting.
so when Bo chopped it, he chopped it pretty heavy, which is what I wanted, but the quarter windows became tiny. I mean, they were like
Yeah.
little itty bitty quarter windows, right? So I obsessed about that, and I read all the old books, all the old Barris books, anything I could get my hands on that had classic chopped Mercuries. And it occurred to me what was wrong with the chop. And what was wrong with the chop is the rear window got scooted forward, because a lot of people, they don't realize when the top comes down on a Mercury, you still need to keep the rear window about where it was originally at. You're leaning it down, but the connection point should remain the same. And a lot of guys, what they do is they lower the roof and then they just bring the rear window into it, and it makes a huge long catwalk above the trunk, and it doesn't look right. It looks terrible, actually.
Wow. Okay.
A huge pet peeve of mine. But the reality of it is it's like a sculpture, you know. You're reshaping everything. But anyway, so I eventually figured out what was wrong, and then we cut basically from the B pillar back to the rear window. We cut that all out and repositioned everything to where I wanted it. And I'm telling you, once it was repositioned there, it was like magic. It was like, so my Green Mercury is the second that car being chopped twice. That was my Green Mercury. Bo Hupp did it the first time. God bless him. And then the second time, we redesigned the whole thing and cut out the back parts that we wanted to change and redid them. And it was the smartest thing that we ever did, because if something, you're feeling it and it doesn't feel right, it's bugging you, you're better off, you know, fixing it right then.
Yes.
You know, a lot of guys will just hunker in and they'll just say, well, I'm just going to make this paint extra perfect. And I'm just going to sand it extra perfect. And again, back to the beginning, it's like, I think they're overcompensating for the fact that their design's not right. Yes. So they're obsessing about this paint and getting it glass smooth, when the reality of it is they should have reevaluated the composition and the design. And art's the same way.
Absolutely.
You know, you can really obsess about something, putting too much detail in it, and you really need to back off and say, you know, what is this feeling that it is giving me? What is the design telling me? And is it good? Is it right? Yes. Is the design right? Because if it's not any of those other little things. You know, you have a pyramid, you know, where it's like your ideal, to me, and a lot of people would say that it's reversed, but to me, it's like the design is the key. If you have the design, then you have the content.
Yes.
Then you have the technique and the craftsmanship are you know, below that.
Yeah,
but
that top tier is the skeleton.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
gotta have a good skeleton. If you have the good skeleton, everything else falls into place.
Man, I
totally. But
totally
without
get
that good skeleton, you're just screwed until you fix the skeleton.
There is one thing that I want to talk to you about before we hang up here, is the Disney collaboration that you did, and in general, like what it's like to work with a huge corporation like that as an artist. Like, how do you get those jobs? What is it like?
Well, I met Disney through a car show. So that was a really interesting thing, as a Grand National Roadster Show, which is actually coming up next week.
Yeah.
I've done that show now for, it's like 18 years. I can't believe how old I'm getting. I mean, I guess it's been about like 10 years ago. I was working the Grand National Roadster Show. The lady walks in and she just started buying stickers like crazy. She was like pulling all the stickers that I had and piling them into a pile. And I was like, okay, this lady's buying a few things, you know. And she's like, oh, I love your work. You know, she's like, I work for Disney. I'm the marketing manager for Disney. And we're actually coming out with a new part of Disneyland called Cars Land. And it's all going to be based on the Cars movie. And I would love to work with you on something. Is that something you think you ever would be interested in, or no? And I was like, definitely, you know, I'd love to work with Disney on something, you know. So we stayed in touch, and I ended up doing Cars artwork for them.
Oh, it's so
which
cool.
Always seemed to be the best seller.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, the Cars stuff that I did was always, I think, the best seller for them. But I ended up doing I think 4 different Star Wars themes pieces for them,
Oh,
which was a
wow.
personal nerd dream for me
Oh, for
growing up in a
sure.
Star Wars. I love being able to do Star Wars stuff.
That's awesome. I did not know that.
Yeah, so that was really a fun thing because it's like, growing up in the 80s again, it's like Return of the Jedi that was my jam, So like to
Yes.
be able to do something with lightsabers in it was amazing.
It
Um,
definitely goes with your theme too, of the apocalyptic theme and stuff. That's nice. The aliens and
but I
stuff that
also
you've
did
already.
stuff like I did a Sleeping Beauty one. I did
Wow.
Frozen. I did a
So this
Frozen
was a
one.
long, it was a long working relationship that you had with
Yeah.
them. That's so cool.
Yeah,
I didn't
I
realize
haven't done
that.
something for a couple of years. It seems like ever since COVID happened, it seemed like their working with independent artists really tapered off.
Mm.
So, hopefully something will happen down the road and we'll work together again. But it's been an awesome run, and I'm happy, dude, and I'm happy for all the things that have happened. And so if it doesn't happen again, it doesn't happen again. But
No, yeah, but I just think
my
it's very
experience with
cool.
them overall is that it was great,
Yeah.
and that was really fun. They were very easy to work with. All the departments are different, though. You get like Pixar is a whole different deal. They're their own
Okay.
deal.
Okay.
So they're owned by Disney. That's the parent company. But Pixar, everything with Pixar has to get approved by Pixar. So if I did something like Cars, it all had to go through them. And
Gotcha.
luckily, they were all car guys. So
Oh, that's
it was
lucky. Yeah.
pretty easily to get along with those guys
Wow.
because they're all like me. We all like the same kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and so, but then with Star Wars, I would submit something to Star Wars, and they were pretty easy to get along with. I mean, all the companies I worked with them were pretty easy to get along with. With Star Wars, I think when I did the Chicken Walker, the ATST,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
they
yeah.
loved the design. They were really happy with it. Was the ATST on Endor,
Was
that
that
from
the one
Return
that
of the
had like
Jedi.
the big trees in the background?
That's it. Yep, that's
Yes.
exactly it. Their critique of that one was, well, we want the metal of it to not just be gray, it has to be slightly green because you're on Endor. I love that about working with them, that they would think about something like that. Sometimes your logic tells you no, metal is gray, but the
Right.
reality of it is that metal, maybe on the forest planet, it should be a little green, like maybe it's a little
Yes.
mossy on the forest planet.
That's cool.
And they were absolutely right. So a fun thing about working with some of these companies is that you do learn a lot. They always seem to like what I did.
Hmm.
And so we kept doing more, but they would have some pretty productive comments. But it was like they would oftentimes do the cherry on the sundae for me. The design would be there, and they'd say, well, Doc Hudson, if Doc Hudson is racing and winning Lightning McQueen,
Hmm.
Doc Hudson should have a slight smile. And you know what I
So are
mean?
you drawing these by hand while they're telling you to do this, or is it all digital? You're doing it digital so you can kind of
Well,
change
in
it
this
as you go.
situation, and with Disney, I do digital first
Okay, okay.
because I have to. Well, in most commissions, I prefer to do digital because people change their mind.
Yeah, I saw that
And
on your
it's
website that
not,
you start with the digital first and then do the final
well,
painting
it depends
after.
on the project. Stuff like I like to just draw it out. I like to draw it out and then do an ink drawing from that. And sometimes the drawing can be on a post-it note. I
Yeah,
mean, I have some
yeah,
of the most ugly drawings you have
same.
ever seen in your life
Yeah.
because I'll be sitting in church or I'm sitting somewhere that I should probably not be thinking about art, but I am.
Hmm.
And a post-it note might all be there, or a phone. I can, do a sketch on a phone
Oh,
too.
yes, yeah.
But then I can draw that out, and maybe I want to trace a car. I might trace that onto the sketch. But if I trace out a car, I trace out some element with tracing paper. I always have in my mind my own little rules that make that car mine. And it's not just about swapping certain things. It's like that gets back to that language thing we talked about. Like
Yeah.
I have a certain language that I tell my story with, and I think it's a certain thickness of line.
Yeah.
It's a certain, you know what I mean?
Oh, totally. And I respect that you know that about your artwork. That's like, in my opinion, a very professional, that's a very unique thing to find. And I think when an artist can call themselves a professional, they know that about their work. Like Bo Monster was saying, like, I made something look too realistic. So I kind of scratched it up a little bit to make it look less realistic. Even though it looked really good, it's just not what
That's
he was
totally.
going for with his style.
Yeah. And that's
That's
that whole
cool.
correcting your mistakes thing. I mean, we
That's
get
cool.
so afraid of correcting our mistakes, and that's that's a blessing that you can see your mistakes if you
Oh,
can
100%.
identify them, because
Yes.
sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're thinking, I did this exactly the way I planned to do it. I followed all the rules. I did exactly what I wanted to do, and it's not quite jiving with me. It's not like completely fitting,
Right.
and
Right.
we have to be willing to go to make changes. I just think that life doesn't give a crap about your plan. That's how I feel.
That's true.
I feel like we are divine beings and we are influenced from a greater power, and that's great.
Yes.
But also, I think we're just a small, insignificant speck amongst a lot of things going on. And we have to have the humility to know that life doesn't care about what we think is best. We have to be open to what these other possibilities are and be willing to change and tweak those things. Hopefully we can get a whispering in our ear about what those answers are, and then we can change them. Because to just follow this point A to point B path, I think is a disservice to us artists and just human beings in general. We find joy by things being the best that they can be.
Yes.
Whether that's our personal relationships, whether that's cars, whether that's art. To me, the goal should always be the best that it can be. And I think that if we follow that sort of accident or deviance from what the original plan was, deviation, not deviance. All this talk about church, it's got deviance in my head.
Yes, yeah.
Deviation, we have to be open to deviation in order to find the magic, and there's magic out there. There's a lot of magic, I think. It's incredible how much we have at our tips. And I think we got to let go, I think, of this whole plan thing, have a plan. That's great. But you got to be open to changing the plan as it moves along, because if you don't, man, you're going to miss the magic. That's why I kept bugging you so much about your constellation art and your night scenes. I'm like, damn, this lady is onto something, because this is really interesting work. You could do a whole series just about classic cars and night scenes with stars. Everybody who has an old car has a nighttime feeling or a nighttime story about that old car. That's or true. Any old car. It's just, there's something about it. There's something about driving in the cool summer night air in an old car. Yes. It's just the best.
Yes, I definitely took heed to your advice, and you'll see later. But yes, I definitely am excited about that.
Well, that's the little bits of magic.
Well, yeah, and I think it goes with
set out for that.
No.
Something happened, divine inspiration, magic, luck. I don't care what you want to call it, but it happened.
Yeah.
Life doesn't care about if you were painting pinup girls.
Yes.
Life doesn't care. Now life has thrown you this curveball of this other thing.
Yes.
And it's you can choose to follow that, or you can choose to not follow that. That's up to you. But what a sad thing to not follow the magic,
Oh, that's so, so true. And I think God puts people in your life as, I don't want to say guardian angels, but hint givers. I'd been looking for a yes, do this, or yes, on certain things. And then I got your message, and it was, that is not a coincidence. Cause I'd been thinking about this and praying about it, and I got your message, and I was, that's very random, but it's not random. So I appreciate that.
Your destiny is following your actions. You're thinking about it, you're pondering on it, you're using faith and prophecy. Yes. And so all the things that are going to trail behind that in a wake, if you, so to speak, that wake is going to follow where your head is going. We talked about the head leading, and your head, your spirituality, and all these aspects of you using faith and prophecy and praying and thinking about these things. It's moving along, and you don't realize that there's a lot of stuff following behind you because of those decisions.
Yes.
You're cutting a way through life, and you're sending ripples out from you in the actions that you take. And I think all of us do that, and sometimes that isn't really apparent, but it's really exciting if it is apparent and you figure it out,
All right, guys, thanks so much for tuning in to my conversation with Max Grundy. If you're interested in learning more about his artwork and his car builds, you can check out his website at maxgrundy.com. Give him a follow over on Instagram. It is Max_Grundy.
Thank you for listening to The Curated Craftsman. You can support this podcast and become a member of our creative community through the Hand, Head, and Heart Collective on Patreon. If you were inspired by this conversation, please leave a review, share the show, and subscribe.